Welcome to the Inspiration North Podcast, inspiring stories from inspirational people and how they found their passion, their true north. I'm James Eves.
And I'm Michelle Minikin, and this is the Inspiration North Podcast.
Today's episode, just because no one else is doing it, doesn't mean that you can't. With Ceryn Rowntree, we talk about why everyone should have some time away from the daily grind to get perspective on life, how she counsels for the soul, not just for the person in front of her, and hear all about her Divine Feminist Podcast, which just happens to be one of Michelle's favourites.
Ceryn is a soul-led therapist, writer and guide based in Northumberland. After beginning her career in corporate communications, she retrained as a counsellor after realising she needed more from her work. Combining this with her experience in spiritual work, Ceryn married the two together to create soul-led therapy, which she offers online to clients across the world. Ceryn is the host of the Divine Feminist Podcast and author of the Teen Spirit Guide to Mediumship, with her second book due out this year. Away from work, Ceryn can usually be found walking in the woods with her dog Carly.
It is another gloriously sunny day in January in Inspiration North headquarters. We're looking at the skylight. It is fabulous. And it's not just you and I this time, Michelle.
No.
Which it was for our podcasts, which was a bit weird. So thankfully, we have a guest this time. So welcome to you, Ceryn.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to go with the good starting point, aren't we? We're going to take you back to being, I was going to say a little person, but that's...
I'm quite little anyway.
How rude, James. How rude. I do apologise. Take back to childhood. Did you have any idea what you wanted to be when you were growing up?
Yes. So, well, I did go through a phase when I was really small of deciding that I wanted to work in an ice lolly factory.
Oh, cool.
Which is a bit weird because later on in life I developed this weird phobia of ice lolly sticks. So that would never have worked. Fortunately, we moved away from that. I always wanted to be a writer. My whole life I wanted to be a writer. I wrote my first picture book when I was 6 and couldn't understand why nobody would let me send it off to a publisher.
Oh.
I know. And I remember being maybe 14, 15 and going to a careers development counsellor, and she sat me in school and she sat me down and said, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" And I said, "I want to be a writer." And she laughed and said, No, a real job. What do you want to do? And I said, I want to be a journalist then. And she said, "No, you need a real job. What's your third choice?" And I went, and at that point I was at school. I really enjoyed drama. So I was like, maybe acting. And she just sort of shook her head. And that was that. But I always wanted to...
You weren't allowed to be any of those three.
I couldn't be any of those things. What could I do? So I went to university and decided I was going to do journalism and American studies because I really liked going to America. Journalism would sort of, tick that writing box. And the first day I was there, somebody came into the classroom and said, "We're starting a course in public relations. Anybody interested? Here's what it's all about." And I thought, that kind of ticks some boxes. I get to stand up and make pictures in front of people. Bit of drama. I get to write. Bit of that. All right, I'll give that a go. But it all stemmed from this idea that growing up, I always just wanted to write. It was the only thing I ever really wanted to do was write books, really.
What was the theme of the 6-year-old Ceryn's first novel?
It was called Mr. George the Giant, and it was about a giant called Mr. George, who I don't really know what else happened to him. I've got it somewhere in my house, but I just know that he was a giant who had a friend who was a little girl, and they would go off on adventures together. I wrote another one about a rabbit who, for some reason, this rabbit decided to teach children how to count.
I like that.
Why that never became some sort of great success, I don't know. But that was my 6-year-old picture book was about Mr. George the Giant.
So what about writing then as you got a bit older? Was there anything was it sort of murder mysteries, or was it more fantasy type stories? Children's type books? Yeah. Is there any kind of theme that you were thinking of?
I think I wrote a bit of everything. As I got older, I remember sending a book off to a publisher or a manuscript off to a publisher when I was 14, I think. And that was a bit of a romance. It was a bit of a romance novel. And I remember they came back and said, "Your writing shows great maturity, but it's not something we're going to publish right now." And I was like, oh my goodness, that's it. I was 14 and they said my writing showed great maturity. That should have been something really awesome. But I just used to write a bit of everything. I always had notebooks full of stuff just lying around the house that were kind of half finished chapters of things. And I used to go to all these whenever there was the opportunity to go and hear from writers. I'd be like, I'm there. I was sat right at the front of the room listening. So it was just a bit of everything. And when I eventually got the opportunity to write a book, it was offered to me, and I just thought, just take it, just snap it up, and then you've done this, and everything you write from here is your choice to write whatever you want, but just do what you're told, basically. But I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because back then with the careers counsellor, writing is not a career. Nobody gets to be a writer.
It's like loads of people do.
Well, they do. And also now with blogs, anybody who has a business is writing. And I think for me, what I've learned in the last few years is that my work now as a counsellor, I'm always hearing people's stories, and I'm kind of joining the dots within people's stories and helping them to do that for themselves. So I'm telling stories, but in a different way. And I'm hearing stories, but in a different way. So I still write. I have this series of novels in my head that I'm absolutely determined to make a start on this year. But
you heard it here first.
Exactly.
There's your accountability now.
Oh Lord. But it's all about the stories, and it's all about just pulling together those stories and helping people to understand how they join the dots for themselves. And it's just it's almost looking at it through a different lens, isn't it? I guess.
Which is often, you need an external perspective. I think we become, whether you call it blinkered or when
you get stuck in those habits, I suppose, isn't it? And you can't see the wood for the trees.
Definitely.
She's a load of cliches, but yes.
They're cliches because they're true, though.
Cliche bingo.
Ooh, we should do that.
So and that's what I like about that as well. Is, I mean, storytelling, we often say is one of the oldest forms of communicating and sharing information, etc. And by working with lots of different people, you're then gaining all of this wisdom and experience that you can share with the world.
Definitely. I hope so. Anyway.
So going back to PR university, what was next?
So I left university and went and got a job working for an energy company, and then kind of continued that career. So had 10 plus years working in corporate communications, in energy, finance, sport, IT. And then meanwhile in the background was thinking, this isn't necessarily all it's cracked up to be. So I got probably about 5 or 6 years into that career and just thought something here needs to change. It just doesn't feel right for me. It's not, I could see all these people who had these amazing ambitions to succeed in the corporate world, and that's brilliant, good for them, but just wasn't my cup of tea. It just wasn't my thing. It didn't light me up. And so I decided something needed to change. So I went back to went back to college initially, studied counselling, and qualified as a counsellor. And then did the two hand in hand for a few years, and then reached a point where I was like, okay, it's time to be self-employed. It's time to make that change. Still do a bit of comms work in the background because
brings in the money.
It brings in some money, and I enjoy it. To be honest, it scratches a bit of an itch for me as well. But just decided it needed to change, and I think that was quite necessary because back when I first left uni, I sound really old when I say that, but back when I first left uni, the ideas of bringing together the stuff I'm interested in, which was the more sort of spiritual side of things, the more real hippie side of things, it just wasn't possible. It just, no one was doing it. It seemed like such a far-flung dream. I remember reading careers advice from people who would say, you have to find a way to take what you love and make it your career. And I thought, but the things I love, they're not things that I could ever make into any sort of career. It's just not going to happen. And through the winding path that life takes you on, I guess, actually what I realised is I can bring that in. I can knot these different things together and create a career that is the stuff I love, that is all about doing what feels right for me rather than just what everyone else is doing, I guess.
When you had those realizations about the niggle of something's not quite right, I don't have the same ambitions as my colleagues, did you act on that straight away, or did it take a period of time to reflect on it and actually decide what was the right way to go?
I think it took quite a period of time. So I had quite a long time where I was working in that corporate environment, and I was this is a pattern that I think I've repeated so many times, of getting into that place of adrenaline and that place of everyone else is pushing for the same goal. And I just go, yeah, okay, this is what I want. And it's only quite a way down the line I suddenly go, no, that's not what you want. This isn't what is actually important to you. But I think I had quite a few years where I was going for it, and I had that niggle in the back of my mind but didn't really do anything with it. And then when I was 25-ish, I took 4 months out to go traveling, went backpacking around the world by myself. And while it was during that time where I had nowhere that I needed to be other than to catch flights. I had nothing that I needed to do. And I'm a firm believer everybody should, I know this is a very privileged perspective, but everybody should take some time away from their daily grind at some point to be able to give them perspective on it.
Yep.
Because it gave me the perspective to go, what is important, and what are you enjoying about this? What do you enjoy about life at home? What don't you enjoy? And really figure that out for myself. And even then I came back and did the very basic counselling qualifications, and then got to a point with those where I needed to invest more time into it. I was like, no, this is the career path I'm on, whether I like it or not. And I remember vividly coming back from working until about 11 o'clock one Friday night on a redundancy program of all things. And my dad had come to pick me up. Long story that I won't get into. And I remember sitting in the car bursting into tears, and he turned around to me and said, "Is this right?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Is this what you want to do?" And I just thought, it really isn't what I want to do. Not at all. Why am I getting this upset and this stressed out about something that just isn't right? So I think it took a long period of reflection.
It's interesting actually, when we talk to lots of different people about their journeys, coming to a realization that actually what I'm doing is not something I'm passionate about, not something I really want to be doing. There can be many people in our environment who are either quite positive with such a change, or they can have the opposite effect. There's a couple of elements I see in this. You're going back to study something new while still working, which I think can be a smart option. But then you reach that stage of goodbye to this corporate career as it stands. I'm now going all in with the counselling side. What kind of was the reaction, and was everybody as positive and proactive as your dad in that conversation in the car?
Good question. I think it, again, because I drew it out quite a long time, because I continued to do the two jobs alongside each other for quite a while, it changed. So I remember when I initially decided that was it. I was done with comms. I was going to be self-employed in 2012, end of 2011, start of 2012. And at that point, I remember my mum saying, "I don't think this is a good idea. Is this really wise? Is this what you want to do?" Now, in retrospect, it was a really bad idea, if I'm honest. I wasn't prepared. I wasn't even fully qualified yet. I decided I was going to somehow manage to make something else work, because what I really wanted to do, it wasn't time for. And it was a bit of a harebrained scheme. But that aside, they've always been very supportive. Everyone around me, I think, I've been really fortunate, has always been very supportive, and almost, even if we don't agree this is the right thing, we'll back you. It's what you want to do. It's what you need to do. Fine. But I think moving forward to the next time that I decided, okay, this is it, I need to focus on self-employment, I need that career change, then everybody was absolutely supportive, and everybody was, yeah, you've got to do this, because I would continually find myself in these cycles of just working my butt off for something that just didn't really float my boat, didn't really light me up. And I think I'm quite fortunate. I'm surrounded by quite a lot of perceptive people who will say, "Is this really what you want?" And I'll go, "No, do you know what? You're absolutely right. It's not." "Okay, then what do you want instead?" And so I guess the times when everyone around me hasn't been so supportive are the times when actually they were totally right, and I was just flying off to do something that seemed fun and that seemed like a good idea. But once I've got a bit of grounding on it, generally everyone's been quite supportive.
Yeah, I always find that's the hardest thing to discuss with someone. Is there's the self-employment leap, so there's that pressure of replacing a salary, but then it's continuing the day-to-day, the slog of something that is chewing you on a day-to-day basis. It's sucking the life and soul out of you, so that actually you might be passionate about the counselling side, but to come home from a hard slog it could be a toxic environment, it could be something that just drains you. It's finding that balance of saying, how do I keep going with my passion while I still have the salary, yet that's sucking the life out of me. And that's, I think it's different for everybody.
Yeah.
But
I had a real issue that when I first got to that point, when I first decided to be self-employed, and then had a period where I realised I actually needed to be earning some money, so needed to go back to the bread and butter of the work that I had been doing. I took on a job that I thought was going to be perfect. It on paper was my dream job, and it was incredibly long hours, a really toxic environment, to put it bluntly, really tough. And it was only the whole way through that job I would often sit there and say, but what's the point in me looking for another one? Because I know long term this isn't what I want to do. So what's the point in me looking for another for want of a better word, day job, when I know that long term this isn't my plan? And I think it really took a bit of a shift in my brain to recognise that just because this isn't something I want to do forever doesn't mean I can't be in a happier, healthier place while I'm still juggling those two things. And so I got really fortunate in that I then moved into a comms job that was with a good company, good people. It was interesting, but it wasn't so overwhelming. And everybody there was very well aware of the fact that actually my own business was also a priority. And so I was able to juggle a lot better. But I totally agree with you. And I think you can get stuck in this place of this is a means to an end, so I just have to put up with it. And you don't. It's even a means to an end doesn't have to be
horrific,
painful and horrendous.
But that's a shift, isn't it, mentally? It's to say, when you're stuck in something that you loathe, but you perhaps don't have another avenue, once you do have a plan, there's a structure, you can see a pathway to that making money, to get to a point where you can say, actually, I can now transfer across to putting my full attention to this. It doesn't have to last forever, but still, going to somewhere that you're not really enthused about is tough.
Yeah,
and it's not a straightforward thing to find, especially if the voices around you, from whether they're negative, whether they're positive, it can create a lot of doubt, can't it? To say, well, everyone I'm getting advice from, have they been self-employed? No. Or perhaps some have. And that creates more fog, I've found, in the brain for those who say, what if it doesn't work, Ceryn? Oh, I like the sound of this, Ceryn. This is amazing. Yes, you should totally do that.
Yeah. I found, for me, one of my, one of the biggest or scariest things, I guess, was a lot of the people who were saying to me, this is amazing, it's amazing, you must do this, this is a great idea, it's obviously what you're passionate about, go and do it. A lot of those people, including a lot of friends and colleagues who were self-employed, a lot of those people were coming from environments where they had backup almost. So I have been single for the last few years. So the buck stops with me when it comes to paying the bills. A lot of people that I was talking to would have partners or would be living with a friend or whatever who could pay the bills. And I'd always say, yeah, I get it, but I need to be in a place where I can trust that income more.
Yes.
Because actually if the money doesn't come in, that's it. I'm out on the street. I don't have somebody who can pick up the slack on the bills for a few months. That's just it. I'm out. And that was they were the voices that really gave me fog in my brain, because I would always be thinking, that's great, I'm glad you're so supportive, but let's not forget that actually there's a slightly different dynamic for me, that I have to be able to look after myself. Yes. Otherwise, me and my dog are in a cardboard box on the street.
I keep saying to me, a little boy will be living under a bridge.
Yeah.
At least we've got protection of the bridge. I've picked the bridge out and everything, it's fine. Sorry. It's his face sometimes, it's brilliant. So, do you want to talk to us a wee bit about the more spiritual side of things? Because we've talked to the corporate and we've talked to counselling, but there's a big, huge hole that you haven't mentioned really.
Yeah. So it's something I've always been interested in. I used to, when I was 2, my mum tells this story that when I was 2, we were walking down the promenade or whatever it is at Blackpool, and I was walking along talking to somebody that nobody else could see, and all these people were
just had a shiver.
All these people were looking at my parents going, what's wrong with your child? And my mum and dad were just like, yeah, she does this is just what happens. And my family, you know, I come from my parents are both the children of miners, so there's a lot of spiritualism in mining communities, I guess, because they had a lot of people die, to put it bluntly. So my grandma was always very much, look, just let her get on with it. Don't encourage her, but equally don't discourage her. Just let her go with it. And so I did. So I always just, it was just one of those things. And when I got to maybe 15, 16, it had gone away a little bit because it was weird and all the other kids would think it was weird. So I sort of stopped. When I got to 15, 16, I really just fell back into reading anything related to all things spiritual, a little bit weird, a bit new age. And that just kind of grew from there. So when I was, maybe 22, I started going to a spiritualist church and going in and kind of seeing what that was all about. And it just felt more right for me. And actually that was what got me into counselling in the first place. The counselling side, for a lot of people, they'll lean into a more kind of soulful, I guess, approach to life after they have counselled for a while, because you hear all sorts of different stories. It's quite interesting. For me, I would sit in spiritualist churches and hear people talk to everyone who walks through the door of something like that is there because they're lost and or they're grieving and they're looking for something that will make them feel better. And I'd hear people who would talk to them and not really respect that. I mean, not everybody, but not really respect that. And B, just wouldn't know how to talk to people who were hurting and who were suffering. And I just thought, this isn't right. There must be, if I'm going to be talking to people who are grieving, I need to know the right way to look after them while I'm in conversation with them. And so that was really what led me into counselling, was just understanding how to deal with people who were in that place. And then it just sort of grew from there. I realised that I would sit down and I would do one-on-one readings or card readings or something like that. And I'd find that actually what would end up happening in my sessions wasn't the same as you'd get if you'd go to any other person for a tarot reading. We'd end up having effectively a counselling session, but people would be bringing in stuff that they'd experienced or stuff that they'd read about or stuff that they'd been doing their own sort of soul work with regards to past lives or ancestral patterns and all that sort of stuff. And we'd end up talking about that. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. And then for me, I got to a point where I decided, I've been practicing this counselling lark for a while. I should give it a go for myself. And I really struggled that I would sit in a counselling session and say, and also, for example, I've been working with a past life therapist. I have this past life memory of this. I know it's bringing me a fear of X, Y, and Z. I don't know how to crack that. And my counsellor would go, let's move along. I don't know how to talk about that. And so I kind of found there was this real disconnect between being able to do this spiritual work, be involved with this stuff that I found really interesting, that really seemed to open up a whole other dimension of who I was and what I knew about myself. And then actually being able to ground that in the reality of what's happening in the here and now. And I was like, there just must be a way to put that together. How do we put that together? Because I think there is so much of this. I mean, even when I'm talking about it to you guys, I still struggle with the idea of business and soul work and spirituality because the world wants to keep them very separate. And I was like, but I don't think they are. And so I kind of very much try to mix and mingle the two together. And I've come into a place where actually now when I counsel, I don't do readings or that sort of thing. It's just not my bag. But when I counsel for the soul. I don't just counsel for the person that is sitting in front of me eating cake, although of course that's part of it. I also counsel for how whatever is going on in them emotionally, mentally is affecting their body. I counsel for what they're carrying forwards from their parents. We spoke before about this idea that as children, we are carried on a cellular form, not just inside our mothers, but inside our grandmothers. So we're even physically carrying forward the experiences that we've had from that time. I counsel for that ancestral side of it. I counsel for the more spiritual side, be that what you've found in meditation, what you've found through other healing, Reiki, past lives, all of that kind of stuff. And I kind of look at it as a more, like I say, as counselling for a whole soul rather than just for a body or a mind.
So I'm laughing a bit because we get to a point where I hear something that I don't really necessarily know a lot about, and we learn a lot on the podcast. And so I'm almost trying to process what I've just heard. So is it, do you pick up on things from a person? Is it based on what they're telling you, or are you seeing, feeling, experience things with an individual in a room? What kind of happens?
I think this is where I had a real challenge. So when I first started to train as a counsellor, and as I say, it was that spiritual side of things that led me into that. But there are very defined bounds on what you do as a counsellor. As a counsellor, you do not advise, you do not bring anything into the session that the client has not already brought in. And so, I mean, when I trained, you have to do X amount of hours of practice. And when I trained, I remember having a guy that I was working with who we got halfway through our third or fourth session, and one day he turned to me and said, "You know that my dad's here, don't you?" And I was like,
I'm not allowed to say
that. So I just said, "Oh, and what makes you think that?" And he said, "Well, because I know that my dad's here, and I have a sensation that you know as well." And I was like, "What do I do with this?" And so it took me a long time to be able to go, right, how do I don't want to cross those boundaries because it's not appropriate. I mean, I've sort of found ways to do that, but I think by and large, what I do is I work with what people bring to me. However, one of the founding principles of person-centered counselling, which is what I was initially trained in, is the idea of advanced empathy or third ear listening. And so that is about tapping into what the person isn't necessarily telling you, but you know what's going on. And actually, the more I leaned into it, the more I realized that's not that different from picking up on what I pick up on. Actually, a lot of stuff, because I'm a firm believer that when it comes to whatever you want to call it, you know, that spiritual awareness, we can all do it. It's just that we often don't. There's so much else going on, we don't. And so the majority of what I work with is what people bring into sessions. However, I will bring additional stuff in when it's appropriate. I will work with people, you know, I'll often have people who'll say things in a session and I'll go, "Have you considered what if we were to go down this road?" And just give them it to think about. I would never force it onto them. I just kind of offer it up. I think it helps now that I'm working for myself and I'm very defined in the clients that I work with, because I know that they're coming to me because they're in that place already. But I think you've got to tread a very fine line of working with what the client brings to you without overstepping that boundary.
Okay.
So recently, you started your own podcast.
Yes.
And I'm a massive fan of it.
Thanks.
So do you want to tell our listeners a wee bit more about that?
Yeah. So my podcast it's called The Divine Feminist, and it's really based on an idea. For the longest time, I refused to call myself a feminist because the idea that I had of feminists is that they were all these angry women who hated men, wanted to burn their bras, and didn't shave their armpits. And there are a lot of men that I like. I, at the time, didn't really want to be angry. Now I'm a lot angrier, but that's okay. To be honest, now I probably, with the exception of the man hate, and fit that description a lot better. But I would be, you know, I liked bras. I liked very pretty bras. I wasn't gonna, and I didn't really like having hairy armpits. It didn't feel very nice. So for a long time especially in my early 20s, the idea of feminist, the picture I had in my mind was just not something I wanted to be. And yet I knew there needed to be something done. And I spent a big chunk of my late 20s, early 30s working in an incredibly toxic environment that was very male dominated, that was all about, you know, working as long and hard as you possibly could, about sort of being big and strong and tough, and about the fact that men could do whatever the hell they wanted and women just had to kind of put up with it and look after everyone.
Go and get the tea.
Exactly. And it just wasn't okay with me. And it really got me to this point of, understandably wasn't okay. It really got me to this point of feminism is so important, and yet I feel like there's something missing. I feel like for me it needs to be something different. And meanwhile, I'd been doing a lot of reading, a lot of learning in the background, a lot of work on myself in the background around kind of the more, you know, reading up on the goddess cultures that were once upon a time, reading up on sort of my body and the connections of my body to nature, to all of these different things. And it took me back to this place of actually feminism, while, you know, women not being able to be safe walking down the streets at night, while the fact that we have more CEOs called John in the FTSE 100 than we have women. Those things are horrendous. They're absolutely terrible. But actually, the further I got down the line, the more I started to realise that they're a symptom and not a cause. That actually the cause is the fact that everything we consider feminine, or that if you look at the Eastern yin-yang energy, everything that we consider more on the yin side of things, has just been mocked and vilified and sort of degraded for so much of recent history. And by recent, I mean centuries. That's really the issue, isn't it? The issue is that society is so out of balance that it goes further back than the politics even. And so I really started thinking about this, and I started using this term divine feminist to describe myself for ages. And I just kept thinking, I need to do more with this. So I started a podcast last year that is all about that idea. And it's, talking to people who in some way are redressing that balance, about how they're redressing that balance. And the whole idea is about connecting back in with yourself and asking, okay, where have I got these preconceived ideas of, to simplify it, that yin and yang energy, that receptivity or drive, that sort of action or surrender, all of that stuff. Where do I have those preconceived ideas within me? And actually, if I step back and plug into me, what feels more right for me? What's better at redressing that balance? And how do I put that back out there into the world in who I am? And my dream is that maybe we'll get to a point where actually, if we all start connecting with that, we change the whole world. That's everybody's dream, right? But even if just for us, that means that we can have a healthier life whereby we're not constantly working 60, 70-hour weeks, whereby it's not all about go, 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 whereby we're not looking, as I said before, those kids who want to have the more artistic careers. We're not going, no, that's not a real job. Go and study science. It's about figuring out the balance. Science is massively important, but then if we don't have art to look at, if we don't have books to read, we lead pretty miserable lives. It's trying to find that balance with everything we do, I think.
It's interesting. It's one I've always struggled with as well. So I would say it's fairly intuitive as a human, but I'm a trained scientist.
Yeah.
So it's almost that side of, I think it's only been the last couple of years that I've almost allowed that more intuitive side of things to come out, because it's like, where's the evidence-based research on this? And it's fascinating. There's so much stuff that science hasn't proven.
Yeah.
And my biggest bother actually with my psychology degree is you can always have research and science proving every which way.
Yeah.
So every psychology essay ended up with more research is needed.
Yeah.
So we don't know everything.
Yeah.
And, a book that was written and then changed a lot over the years to remove the women and it's interesting and fascinating stuff just to be open-minded about it all.
That's exactly it, isn't it? It's open-minded, and it's just allowing yourself to feel what's right for you personally, I think, instead of the world will tell us so many things. And now we're bombarded with information everywhere we look. And I think sometimes we can find evidence to prove everything.
Yep.
Because every human being's different. So every human being will lead to different test results. So I think a lot of it is just about tuning back into yourself and figuring out what's right for you regardless.
It's the whole trusting your gut thing.
Yeah.
And I think recent science has proven that we do have almost brain cells in our stomach, so it's the gut thing is a thing.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating.
It is. It's interesting. I'm really intrigued to see what happens in the next, 10, 20 years, which direction science takes, because I think there are a lot of people like yourself, Michelle, who are saying, but maybe let's just lean into this a little bit more and see what's there for it, see what we come up with. And I'm just interested to see where it goes, because I think it's, the world's at an interesting place, I think, where things are changing.
I think we're at a bit of a tipping point.
We are.
Yeah.
We are.
I was thinking back to what you said earlier about the intuition as a child. And often I think it's something we lose. I genuinely believe that kids are very good at picking up, who's worth getting involved with, who's worth playing with, who's a wrong un. I think the intuition is usually there. My dad always used to talk about being in the supermarket. So he was a head teacher, and it's a bit like the movies like Miracle on 34th Street, where a kid would know that's Santa Claus. And there was something about my dad that kids would be like, something about him, and it's kind of like sidling up to him, and they just seemed to know that he was someone who was genuinely interested in kids, wouldn't talk down to them. So there's something that we lose as we get older, whether that's taught to us at school. I don't know exactly what that is, but you could imagine that if we are more open-minded, a bit more spiritual, connecting more with ourselves, that can surely only be good for the future. I always say about growing up as a young lad, what are you told at school and the like? Maybe this is part of the intuition that's lost, is, don't cry, don't show your emotion, that's for girls. And I think that's where it all begins, why you end up with these...
It's a lot of peer pressure though as well.
Yeah.
Almost you're allowed to be an individual as a child and you look to be an individual as an adult, but the whole middle bit you have to fit in and not be weird or you get picked on.
Yeah, totally. And I think we're told that the human race has reached a point where we like to put each other in boxes, don't we? Because if we're in boxes we can understand each other, so we like to be in boxes. But because we're so determined to put one another in boxes, we take away so much of that individuality, and with it we take away so much of that intuition. And it almost doesn't matter to me I'm talking about the spiritual stuff, it doesn't matter what you do and don't believe. Actually, for me, the crux of it is about believing in you. It's about being able to listen to yourself and listen to that gut and believe in yourself. And I think we are often forced into these boxes. Yeah. And it knocks out so much of so many of our differences, so much of, again, let's use another cliche, so much of what makes us special, so much of what makes us unique is kind of pushed out of us because we're just shoved into, no, this is the way it should be. And that's easier, at the risk of getting really political, and I promise I won't. It's easier to manage when we're in boxes, isn't it? We're all easier to... I don't know, it's easier to be controlled, it's easier to know what we're dealing with, it's easier to just keep everything in line when we're all in the place we're supposed to be.
Yeah, it's true. With feminism, you've talked about bra burning, men hating. How do we move forward from that where everybody actually supports everybody?
Well, that's the question. I think that's really one of the underlying things that led me into this idea of divine feminism, because for me, I have absolutely experienced that out of balance masculine approach to society. I think we all have in different ways, men included. The fact that men aren't, it's such a cliche, but men aren't allowed to express emotions. Well, it just shows how out of balance our society is. A friend was telling me the other day that her ex-husband's son is now being punished when he cries. He's 2. That's not okay. That's absolutely not okay. No. And I mean, it's not okay generally, but as an example of this, not okay. And I think we're in this place where, even for me, having experienced the downside of being a woman in this society, but I get that I've got privilege. The fact that I have a white face, that I come from a stable home environment, that I am pretty well educated, that I am cisgender, that I am straight, those things are real privileges. And we absolutely need to redress the balance so that somebody who doesn't look like me has the same privilege in the world that I do. That's where we need to get to, that someone who otherwise would have been downtrodden by society, would have been vilified by society for who they are, for the way they look, for their experience of life, whatever it may be. But it's such a fine balance, isn't it? Because we need to find a way to do that doesn't then just vilify everyone else. And I think where we're getting to now is that there are a lot of people out there who are scared to be themselves, who are scared to actually talk about who they are and to be their own self in the world. And the ideal place that I would get to is where we just don't have to worry about those boxes that we tick. We worry about just respecting people for who they are and for who they bring to the table in every table. There's a long way to go to get there, because there is so much imbalance and so much inequality in the world. But where I would like to get to, where I think this idea of divine feminism comes from, is the idea that women are no better than men in the same way that men are no better than women. I mean, I think women are better, that's because I am one, but women are no better than men in the same way men are no better than women. That this colour skin you have does not make you any better or worse than someone else, but that all of our different experiences, that all of our different backgrounds, that all of our different qualities, and by the way, when I say that, I don't mean as a community, I mean as individuals, they are all such special things to bring to the table. So can we just respect one another for who we are and for what that is?
Yeah, I get that. I sometimes think that the whole box element, I think about, for example, the census. So I know I've got some bizarre ideas, but when you're filling in, you mentioned about different races, there should be one box on a census. If we had someone come from another planet, they would identify us as human, if we used one word.
It's my favourite word.
I'm human. I look a bit different to my friend here who lives in another country. This other friend who dresses a bit differently because of their religious beliefs. However, we're all human.
But I think...
Is that too idealistic?
I don't know. I think there's a fine balance there as well, isn't there? Because we have to respect people for their heritage and for who they are and what they bring to the table. And I have done an awful lot of work and really tried to go out there over the past couple of years and learn from people who are different than me, really, but people who are from sort of non-white backgrounds. Because what I realised, let's be totally blunt, here in the northeast of England, it is a very white place to live. It is everybody comes from a very, very similar background. There are, so many similarities. And I remember when somebody first said white privilege to me, and I was like, how dare you say I have privilege? I come from a working class family and I did not grow up with privilege. Yeah, but you did because your face is white. And we need to understand that our differences are part of what makes us special. And I totally agree with you to one point that I think that idea of we're all human. Yes, we are. And that's what matters. But that doesn't take away from the fact that also we are all this fabric, this tapestry of amazing humans with amazing different experiences and amazing different beliefs and amazing different lives. And to go back to what I was saying earlier, stories and it's our differences that make those stories so beautiful and so powerful and that enable us to create this, again, here's maybe an idealistic, this world that is able to shine in the way that it truly can, because we have this whole spectrum of humanity. But we also need to remember that at the root of all of that, the commonality is that human box. And the commonality is that we need to treat people as they want to be treated. We need to respect people for who they are. We need to listen to the stories of other people, and we need to pay attention to what those people are telling us, and remember that also what really matters is that they're human just like us. It doesn't matter whether they're a different gender, a different race, a different sexuality, a different religion, whether they identify differently to us. That doesn't mean that we don't have something we can learn from them. That doesn't mean that they don't know more than us in a lot of different ways. That doesn't mean that we or they are any better or worse than us. It just means that we just need to listen to each other and respect each other. That sounded very idealistic, but I hope that makes sense.
It does, but I think it's something to strive for, but it's a tricky one, isn't it?
It is.
I think as humans, we almost need boxes, don't we? We talked about this earlier, if you place someone in a box and then you know who you are, who is in front of you, potentially how you may have to interact with them. It's a bit of a strange one.
Well, the whole sort of stereotype and bias is they're all brain shortcuts to stop us all becoming totally overwhelmed. So if we didn't have, if our brains didn't have that ability, we wouldn't be able to cross the road because there's so many pieces of information. Yeah. So our brains do like to automatically sort of predict the future, I suppose, by saying, well, this human in front of me looks like a white dude. Bit of a northeastern accent, so white northeastern dude, so you can kind of know how to relate to them, and it's a brain shortcut, and everybody's got it.
And I think that's where we're going to get to in the next, I wouldn't like to put a time scale on it, but that's where we're getting to, isn't it? The point that as we start to respect one another for who we are, and again, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to undo that, we will hopefully, you would hope, get to a point where the stereotypes and biases that we need to predict the future are such that we actually don't treat each other disparagingly as a result of that, where we can, and I don't know how this is going to work because it probably will take a much more evolved brain than mine to understand it, but where we can find a place that we can understand each other without demeaning each other, I guess.
And I think it comes with kind of accepting yourself first.
And also with knowing that you don't know everything.
Yeah, it's that fixed and open mindset. It's really interesting that those people that will argue, especially those on the internet, that will argue the toss that they are right.
Yeah.
And we had over Christmas, we had the sidecar guys in who circumnavigated the globe in a scooter and sidecar, and they said specifically spending time with lots of different people from lots of different backgrounds, lots of different countries. Has really opened their eyes to the world, and people are significantly nicer than the newspapers will have us believe.
It's
because
0.01% that you hear about that doesn't represent, so that they would say the traditionally more scary nationalities turn out to be the most hospitable, for example.
The media likes to sell us this idea of dangerous other, doesn't it?
Yes.
And it doesn't matter who we are, that what would have kept us safe many, many years ago was knowing that we know that people who are like us are going to keep us safe, so it's okay. But actually now the world has shrunk to such an extent that we can't just be in that place. And I mean, we could talk about this forever in terms of where we are politically, in terms of where we are in the whole of Western world at the moment, but we're not in that place anymore. We need to know who we are, as you say, and know what is and isn't right for us generally in our own selves. But we also need to just accept that actually what we're being told, a lot of it isn't true, and just look outside of ourselves and open our minds and explore the world. Be that in a sidecar and a bike or whatever it may be. Explore the world and learn more and learn from other people.
Yeah, I read a really interesting thing just before Christmas. So everyone's like, oh, 2019 was like the worst year ever. And it's like, no, it was the best year ever. So there's more people out of poverty, more people educated, more women being treated well, less people in prison, all of this stuff. Proven, more literacy across the globe, and more electricity, access to clean water, all of that stuff, all the really cool, good stuff. Nobody's talking about it because it doesn't bleed, so it doesn't lead.
Yeah.
Yes, I totally agree. Now we're going to jump into the quick fire question round, which we still haven't got a name for, but that can be something in 2020 we come up with.
Asking D, you'll tell us.
Yes, good idea. Note to self. Question number 1. If you could have a superpower other than what you already possess, what would it be and why?
That's an excellent question.
It's only because we watched Shazam last night.
I watched Shazam the other week too. I really enjoyed it. So there are many, many answers. The first one that comes to mind, I would like to be able to talk to animals. My dog has not slept properly for the last 7 years. It's basically like having a newborn child constantly.
Wow.
And I'd really like to be able to just talk to her and say, for goodness sake, will you just go to sleep and just stay asleep? Why do you keep waking me up?
What is wrong with you?
So it's probably a bit of a rubbish super. Well, no, I think it's a good one.
No, it's great.
It's probably a bit of a weird answer.
No, it's different.
But that would be my answer. I'd just like to talk to animals. Like a little Dr. Dolittle.
Yes, I was thinking I have to watch the new one. Is it out yet?
Don't know.
Yeah. Anyway, I love the old Dr. Dolittle. Okay, so my question is, if you could go anywhere in the whole wide world that you haven't been yet, where would it be?
Oh, that I haven't been yet. Oh, that's a difficult one.
No.
I'm quite fortunate because I've been to quite a lot of places. But then everywhere you go, you realise there are so many more places that you want to go. I'd really like to spend some time in Hawaii. Maybe that's a bit of a cop-out because I did go there in as far as I stopped in a plane that refueled in Honolulu
Does
Airport
it really
once.
count though, does it?
But I don't think that counts. So I'd really like to go to Hawaii. I just think it looks beautiful. It's so interesting. I worked with a client last year who is in Hawaii, and every time I'd talk to her, I'd be like, oh, how's Hawaii today? And she'd tell me, and I'd just think, oh, it sounds like the dream. So I think that, or I'd like to go somewhere up north and go and see the Northern Lights properly. I've seen them from here, but I'd like to see them.
Keep us posted. We'll do a group trip.
Yeah.
It's on the bucket list, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the final question for the quickfire round: if you could go on a date with anyone on the planet,
It could be a mate date. It doesn't have to be a boy.
or it could be a mate date. Yes, it could be just someone you'd like to have lunch with. Let's say, who would that be?
Chris Evans, who plays Captain America, not the
not
ginger
that.
guy off the radio. No, Captain America. Him. That didn't even take any thought, did it?
No, it didn't.
I
I
just
like
think
that.
he's wonderful.
Oh.
Yeah. So
Would he have
wouldn't
to be
be a mate
dressed
date.
as Captain America or
No,
okay.
he could wear whatever he wanted. It's all good. It's all good.
I love it.
That's good.
Yeah, that would be it. I mean, he's obviously looks very good. I like the fact that he's great at taking the, can I swear?
Yeah.
He's great at taking the piss out of Donald Trump on Twitter, which I really
You
love.
need to have a look at that. I enjoyed that
He
stuff.
just seems like a nice guy. I just like him a lot. So yeah, it would be him.
Excellent. We'll have to tag him into the podcast and see whether
tag him
see whether it happens. You never know. Shy Ben's getting out.
Shy Ben's getting out. That is my favourite quote of all time.
Excellent. And so if we could get you in a time machine and you could go and sit and have a cup of tea with 18-year-old Ceryn, what advice would you give to her?
I think I would say just because no one else is doing it doesn't mean that you can't. And I think that goes with everything. I spent so much of my 20s thinking, first of all, in terms of work, what I would love to do, it's not a viable option, as I've said. Says who? Just because no one's doing it doesn't mean you can't. But also I spent a lot of my 20s thinking I have to, we talked about this before we start recording, I call it like the game of life. I have to get an education, get a job, get a house, get married, have babies. And actually my life hasn't quite gone that way. It's just happened slightly differently. Some of those things might still happen. When Chris Evans reads the podcast tweet, it'll all be good. But some of those things might still happen. But I spent a long time in my 20s thinking that I had to hit the same goals that everyone else was hitting. And actually, that's just not the way life has to work. So I think that would be, I would just say, do your own thing. Just because no one else is doing it the way you are doesn't mean that you shouldn't be doing it. It just means that you maybe need to spread your wings a little bit and see how it can be done otherwise, or just go rogue and do it your own way anyway.
I love that.
Yes, excellent advice.
Excellent advice for everybody, even now. Okay, so I haven't actually discussed doing this, but so James is a little bit scared, but that's okay, that's normal. So we have a really good friend in common who listens to both of our podcasts. So I thought it would be lovely for us to say a little shout out to little Miss Nicola Andrews.
Yes.
Because she will be listening.
She will. And it wouldn't have happened. This wouldn't have happened without Nicola.
No,
so thanks, Nicola. Hi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Wherever you are in the world.
I know, she's always on holiday.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh.
If someone is interested in soul-led therapy, what is the best way to find you?
So my website's having a bit of a revamp right now. It may be back up and running the way I want it by the end of January, but we'll see. So I would say if you check out my Instagram, is probably the first thing, which is at miss_CMR. That's probably the first place to go. And then my website is www.cerynrowntree.com, since both of those names usually need spelling out to people. I'd just say check out the podcast notes probably to see how to spell my name. But yeah, website or Instagram is usually the best way to go. And the podcast.
The Divine Feminist Podcast, which is available on most major platforms.
On all good podcast platforms. Yes.
Excellent.
Well, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for listening. Check out all the show notes at inspirationnorth.com. Join us again for the next episode when we'll be chatting to another inspirational person. If you like this, subscribe and tell your friends. If you didn't like this, subscribe anyway and tell everybody.